Amen.
Yes, you're aware. I have pressed record to the pearls and be able to spread them more widely, because we are only 7, which is unusual. So, John.
That's great. Thanks, Matthew, and thanks so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be with you. I think this is about the third kind of time I've spoken, maybe in 3 different jobs actually, because I used to be at the Shaftesbury Society, which is where I first met Simon, and also Jonathan, I think I was involved there, and then at my last job at the West London Mission, which is part of the Methodist Church, and as Matthew said, I'm now working for the government. Which is very, very different. And I just want to, I guess, share some thoughts. And because we're a small group, I just want to make it as sort of useful as possible, really. So Matthew and I thought, rather than me deliver a long monologue, we would sort of split it into 3 sections. So I'm going to share my screen, and I've got kind of 3 headings that we're going to talk through. Let's just see. Okay. So hopefully, can people see that?
Yep.
Great. Okay, brilliant. So there's lots of different things we could talk about, but just going to look at these sort of 3 things really. So 5 minutes I'll sort of share on each, and then we can just have some discussion and talk about where we want to go with it, really. So I want to talk about sort of faith in the public square. That's very much linked to the role that I'm doing with the government. And secondly, the sort of future of Christian social action. I know that the social engagement is really important to transform Newham. And I want to sort of spend a bit of time thinking about the future direction of Christian social action. And lastly, I think just what I've reflected on in this different role, the utter relevance of Christian faith and spirituality. And the last one might be a bit obvious, because I know you're a bunch of people involved in churches, and you don't need me to tell you the relevance of the Christian faith. But from the perspective I'm in working government, I think we really need to have a confidence about the relevance and especially its applicability in dealing with social issues like homelessness, which is the area of work that I'm working in. So firstly, I just thought I'd ask a question. Okay, this is a quiz I often do with local authorities up and down the country, and this is one of the questions I ask them. So I'm going to show you 4 homelessness organisations, and you've got to guess which one was not set up by a church or a church minister. Okay, so there's 4. There's Emmaus, Centrepoint, St Mungo's, or Shelter. Any guesses?
I'll guess Shelter.
Yes, I would guess Shelter as well.
But it is a guess.
So I think that
I thought it was a trick question, so I was going to vote Emmaus.
Very, very interesting. Well, a local authority contacted me recently, and they kept calling it Emmaus, and I had to explain how to say it. But basically, I don't think I heard anyone say St Mungo's, and the actual answer is St Mungo's. So despite the fact they've got Saint in their name, apparently when they set up in the 60s, they said that they called themselves that because they thought they'd get less hassle from the police if they thought it was a bunch of reverends doing the work. But Emmaus was set up by a French Catholic priest just after the Second World War in France, a guy called Abbé Pierre. Centrepoint was set up by the Reverend Kenneth Leach, who I'm sure many of you will know or have heard of. Ken worked in the East End for a long time, but when he worked in the West End, St Anne's in Soho, set up Centrepoint, and I used to work for them on that same site. And Shelter was set up by a Bruce Kenrick, a URC minister in the 60s. So the reason for showing you that is that a lot of the best known homelessness organisations have got the church in their history. And there's just a load of logos here that you can see, which show the utter kind of heritage that the church and Christians have in the homelessness sector. And there's lots of organizations probably that you'll have heard of there. Big organizations like the YMCA have got the church utterly in their heritage and their history, and in varying degrees today. The Salvation Army is probably the best of all. It's probably the archetypal Christian homeless organization, really. But loads of others, really, that are Christian. I put a couple in who are from other faiths. But it's clear how hugely important the church has been in the homelessness sphere. And it's not just history as well. You know, over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been this huge rise of church night shelters opening up. And obviously you've got New Way in Newham, there's Growth in Tower Hamlets just down the road. There's over 50 church-based night shelter circuits in London alone, 180 in the whole country. So the church has got this massive heritage going back, but it's also got this huge role in the contemporary homelessness scene. And I was approached about 3 years ago now by the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, because they set up something called the Rough Sleeping Initiative, and their concern was to fulfill the government's pledge to eliminate rough sleeping, to initially reduce it by half and then to eliminate it completely. And I was approached by the person who set up the Rough Sleeping Initiative, was in charge. I've known for a long time, a guy called Jeremy Swain, who used to work at Thames Reach. And Jeremy is an atheist, but we've always had a really good dialogue about faith. He's very, very open and always wanting to discuss these issues. And so he approached me to leave the West London mission. I was actually seconded over to the Ministry of Housing to work on how local authorities locally work with the faith and community groups that are in their patch. And as I'll come on to say, it's a very varied kind of load of relationships. And I think what, you know, just this first section, but, you know, just before I stop, I think this is all a matter of faith being in the public square, you know, not just being in the personal heart, not just being in the individual, but as in your name, Transform Newham, it's around faith being transformative in a public, open way, which changes social situations as well as people's lives. And I've really been so encouraged over the last 2.5 years in this role to see how seriously that's been taken. And of course, you know, there's lots of challenges. There's just a little diagram I used to use when I was at the Shaftesbury Society here, because often all social action involves a sort of mix of ingredients. We've got church there on one side, the buildings, the people, the sense of theology around mission, the long-standing commitment that churches bring. But also you've got this thing called the voluntary sector, which is overlapping, but also distinctive from the church as well. And that is often the way funding comes in. Funding becomes available through the voluntary sector organizations and portals, and there's opportunities that bring, but also there is ideology, good practice. I think equal opportunities would be probably one of the most high profile of those ideologies. And often this Christian social action is operating in that overlap. And I think one of the things over the last 20 years of my work is that I've seen that sometimes the church can lack confidence. Often it's the left-hand side of that diagram, the voluntary sector, that can kind of come in with more authority and more sway and influence. And I think quite rightly, quite a lot of people are concerned about, you know, the secularization of social action and how to maintain a distinctiveness, how those ingredients really work together rather than one side be dominating. And that's a big issue. But in terms of homelessness, This is a model that I use in just about every meeting I have. And I borrowed it from a book that I'd really recommend, at the bottom there. It's called For Good, The Church and the Future of Welfare. And it's by Samuel Wells, who is the vicar of St. Martin in the Fields, which again is one of the most famous churches for its work with homeless people. So this is the last thing I'll do, and then I'll stop for this section. But my job is all about the relationship between the local authority, so say in your situation, the London Borough of Newham, with the faith and community responses to homelessness. So both mainly faith, but also people who've just set up an organisation to help people. And basically, there's lots of C's that are going to come up here, but there is often this sense of contrast and of sometimes conflict between organisations that are seeking to help homeless people and the local authority. I've spent most of my life working in Westminster, and Westminster's where some of those disputes have been at their highest, really. There's often local authorities don't appreciate some of the stuff that's done by local community groups. You might think, well, why don't they? But I think often it's things like going onto the streets to give out food. There's often a lot of conflicts, and we've seen quite a lot of those in Newham, especially in the past. And also a sense of contrast, groups not wanting to be too close to the local authority, certainly not wanting to be told what to do by the local authority. Some Christian groups deliberately don't want to take any money because they don't want to be kind of steered and pushed around by a local authority they're beholden to. So that's often the situation. My job is all about developing these C's, so getting people to communicate, trying to build a sense of complementary work and collaboration, and often where possible commission, so for groups to receive money to do their work. And we've seen a real increase over the last couple of years of money coming in for faith and community responses, which I think has been really, really positive. So it's all about sort of trying to get into that green zone, and I get sort of parachuted into various places, especially where there's conflict and difficulty, to try and get people to work together better. And just lastly, two more C's that I think are really important on this diagram. That there's also the importance of not having a situation where the local authority co-opt the faith and community group. So for example, we'll give you £5,000 and then act like we own you, or just control them and tell them what to do. So these are the sort of the elements that we want to avoid. It's often those blue C's that feed the red C's, really, that actually, groups want to be contrasting because they don't want to be controlled. And some local authorities aren't very good at partnering. They prefer just to be telling people what to do. And actually we've seen over the last few years a real growth actually in their appreciation of what faith and community groups can do and what they can be. But I'll just end there because I think it's a model of engagement, essentially, of faith being able to be in the public square, to influence the local authority, to play a role in the homeless provision, and to actually have the voice and the contribution really valued and heard. But I'm just going to stop there. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Am I back now? There we go.
Yes.
Yeah. Hello. Oh, and here's Angie. That's great. Nice to see you, Angie. Angie's someone who's probably seen a lot of these diagrams before. Yeah, I mean, I thought it'd just be good to
I love your PowerPoints. I steal them. I love your PowerPoints, John, and I steal them
honoured
from you. So yeah, thank you.
I thought I'd just stop there, and any thoughts that sort of triggered off people or questions that they had, and things that I'd said that didn't make sense, or any experiences of that sort of co-option or control, or some of those difficulties that you may have encountered through your relationship with local authorities.
I think for me, there's sometimes been an element where it's almost like they're trying to tick boxes. Just to try and engage, and they tend to arrange meetings which are quite sudden and expect you to be there quite quickly, and you're not really available. They don't plan ahead those meetings, so it becomes quite difficult. So over this COVID season, I've been invited to just so many engagements with the local authority, and in the end you just can't do it because you're one single person in a church when they've got like teams of people, and often at the meetings they've got, you know, about 5 or 6, 7 people that are at the meetings from their own team, just to support them. So it's difficult sometimes to know how many churches are engaging in it, or how many of them are actually people from the local authority. So I have a background, I have a social work background, so I've worked from both sides for many years. So yeah, I'm just a bit skeptical because I know sometimes in my situation it was ticking boxes. We were asked to do these things.
Yeah, certainly there can be real kind of cultural gaps, and I think you know, a key part of my role is kind of faith literacy, really with groups, and trying to get them to understand how churches think. You know, one local authority phoned me up the other day and they said, you know, this local church is doing really good work, but they do talk about Jesus a lot. You know, is that okay? And it's these kind of questions. I said, well, they are a church. What do you expect them to be talking about? You know, that's kind of their job. But you know, I was saying, you know, but are they being coercive or inappropriate in the way they do that? And they said, oh, no, you know, and it's getting people to be confident. I think quite a lot of groups, some of that tick boxing obviously may come from cynical attitudes that we just want to use you for what we want to use, and I'm sure that does happen, but also there's a lack of confidence on their side to actually know, well, you know, how to, you know, are we allowed to challenge, or allowed we to say people can sort of tread on eggshells around faith in some ways. So yeah, I try and urge kind of confidence on both sides, really.
Yeah.
And Nigel's highlighting. Oh, go on, Elizabeth.
Yeah, and what I've also noticed, sometimes they just come because they want the space. They need the space free to do the whatever activity they want to do for the community. Now, so it makes it a bit difficult. They use all the facilities, but still they feel, oh, the church should give to the community, so everything that you provide should be free. And I'm just wondering, is that right? And what can the churches do in terms of that?
Yeah, no, it's not right. I mean, you know, you've got to work on the basis on which you're comfortable with. And I would urge people to really know their own value, because I think churches often have a reach and a connection that local authorities just don't have. They don't have the access to the volunteer groups and the depth of commitment. I remember hearing a really good talk from the vicar at St John at Hackney a few years ago, saying, you know, St John at Hackney Church is older than the London Borough of Hackney, and really saying, you know, we've been here longer, we've been doing a lot of this longer. So I think confidence, you know, to say, well, you know, we could do this event for you, but these are the terms on which we want to do it, and to be clear about that, I think is important. And equally, I don't think it's I do encourage people to work together, but I really don't think it's a good idea for churches to kind of bend themselves out of shape in order to do a partnership. We talked about that with Angie, didn't we? You know, to make sure you're delivering things that you're comfortable delivering, because contracts come and go, but you know, churches have a deeper roots than that, and we don't want to become just dependent on a source of income in a way that's unhealthy.
Thank you.
I think Nigel's point about lots of invitations is sort of contextual, situational, because we've had sort of more than 2 decades of to borrow a phrase, separate development between the faith sector and the council, and with a change of executive mayor, there's a 180 degrees volte face, and now the contributions of all faith groups are are welcomed. But of course, there's a very long taper on both the statutory side and the faith side of wariness. And so there's lots of opportunities right now, and I'm a keen advocate that churches just find their one area of contribution or influence and do that. So I'm engaged at the moment in working with council officers around dying matters and bereavement, and that's really good. The other person becomes a person, and we chat, and there's a sort of normalizing thing that goes on. And Angie's been in lots of those sort of meetings for many years, and as Chancellor Newham, we haven't really talked about mapped who's where and who's influencing what. Yes, so we haven't got to a sort of strategic view. Just different people relate to who they relate, and we're busy doing, but not terribly joined up, perhaps.
Yeah, I think dying's an example of an area where, you know, it's so linked to spirituality and big questions of purpose, and that's a really good example, I think, where the churches and the role, there's such a role for churches to play that local authorities will struggle to. Yes, it is. I think I find in situations of conflict, I have to look at sort of both sides, and sometimes you have got jaundiced attitudes from local authorities, sometimes, but often I think majority of local authorities are very pragmatic. In my experience, they want work done. I haven't found a lot of, now it might be affected by my role because my role is faith, but I haven't found a lot of anti-faith attitudes. I've seen more incomprehension or a lack of understanding, and also quite a lot of things that aren't very good practice in churches that actually have had to be challenged. You know, people not really working together and being, you know, obviously we all know that egos and you know, egos are a problem in the town hall as well as in churches, aren't they? So, you know, you know, those things of getting people to work together, and also not having a kind of savior mentality, whereas, you know, God's told us to do this, so we're going to do it. and in homelessness, the connectivity is so important between organizations, because a lot of these people bounce between different services, and working together is so important. Yeah.
John, I just wanted to ask, honestly, because you work in government, I think many in the church are kind of jaded with the prevailing societal attitudes around church and faith in the public square. What would you say in terms of that is progressive, that you've seen, that is progressive regarding the attitudes of government or government parastatals towards the church? Is it getting better? Is it progressive? Is it regressing? And what can the church do? Because I think many people are just jaded. In my head, I've been here for some time now, and the prevailing attitudes towards faith leave many of us kind of jaded, that society does not want Christianity in the public square. They see us either as a threat or, you know, just to tolerate what we do, what we stand for. And that's just my perception over time. So what can you tell me that is going to give me some sense of hope that things are getting better in terms of attitudes towards the church? You know, that's just I've got a bit of a cynical view towards this, and it's just come from years of trying to engage Christianity in the public square and the general attitudes of government or prevailing society and people that work in government is it's not hostile, but it is not very cooperative.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my role, one of the key things we want to share is that, I'm encouraged by being asked to do this role, by being able to be really, really open, to bring my Christian faith into work. I think some things are real knockbacks to that. I think that the thing that happened last week with Jesus House, for example, with the Labour Party, that is, I think, a very good example, really, of some of the where it feels like there's a big chasm, and a big gap. But I think locally, I see in Southampton, for example, the local authority have asked a church minister to really coordinate all of the work in the homelessness field. Up and down the country, there's loads of partnerships, and generally, I'm talking to local authorities who are so appreciative of the work. So I think, maybe for people who've been doing it a long time, I think there's bound to be some jadedness. But I'm encouraged from where I sit, because I just see a continual relevance of the role of what faith can bring. So I probably can't cure your sort of cynicism or jadedness, but I can share the stories from where I sit, really. And I guess I think renewal. I see lots of potential. Maybe it's on a smaller level, and it's not in that former central role. It's more at the margins. But I find that exciting, really. What I do, if I go on, I think we'll pick up some of those themes, and I'm just going to go into my next section. Is that all right?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So I think this sort of future of Christian social action is really interesting, because there's been so much development over the last 10 years, especially when we look at things like food banks, night shelters, debt counselling. All of these things have been huge kind of growth in social action over the last sort of 10 years. And I mean, I just wanted to share quickly about a friend of mine called Chris, who I got to know. I actually met him at the Greenbelt Festival about 10 years ago. But Chris he'd left the army years before. He had addictions. He ended up sleeping rough for 3.5 years in London, and things got so bad that he tried to commit suicide by going to a petrol station and covering himself with petrol. And what that led to was that Chris got sectioned and went to a mental institution, but after 6 months came out and was moved into a flat. And I just share that story because it's a bit of an illustration of a model that I think is really relevant for Christian social action. That homelessness is made up of a number of ingredients. Most obviously, this sort of poverty of resources, people not having what they need, the lack of affordable housing, the benefit challenges, unemployment, debt, all of these areas, food poverty, things that are poverty of resources, not having things that we need. But secondly, just as important, really, the poverty of relationships. And in the 25 years I've been working in homelessness, I think this has been such a big factor in the homeless people that I've seen coming into the hostels and the places I've been managing. And the family breakdown, the abuse, domestic violence, all of these different areas that mean the relationships that people have are very fragile. And lastly, people's not just relationship with others, but the relationship with themselves. I guess what you could call a poverty of identity, the way people see themselves. And I think all of those three were really, really manifested in Chris. Chris was struggling when he came out the army for work and for resources, but actually his relationships were really ruined by his addictions to drugs and alcohol. You know, he was stealing money off his children, off his wife. She kicked him out. That's what led to him rough sleeping. And of course, all of the time, those things are really undermining someone's identity. And I think addictions really, you know, destroy all three of these things. You know, they take away your resources, they ruin your relationships, and they damage your identity. And I think this is why homelessness is so much more than just houselessness. So, you know, houses are resources and they're really important. Bricks and mortar, they're vital resource. But of course, homes are much more than that. And homes are places fundamentally of relationships and identity. And I think this gives a real clue to the sort of future, I think, of social action work. Because I think the church has resources or has the ability to address each of these areas of poverty in a really specific way. And I think, you know, rough sleeping really sits in the middle where all these things overlap. There's a bit of a spectrum I'll show you here of faith and community work. And on this left-hand side, with homeless people, you can see the sort of street-based help, you know, going out into the street, giving out food and sleeping bags and that kind of stuff. Next there, you've got the sort of indoor versions of that, the soup kitchens and emergency help, and then the night shelters like New Way Run and Growth and many others around London. And then there's more specialist kind of drop-in centres with specific advice, like the New Day Centre and other centres that specifically focus on helping people recover and move through and get support. Supported housing, there's a real growth of schemes, things like Green Pastures and Hope Interaction, who are partnering with churches to offer supported housing. And then lastly, kind of befriending and tenancy sustainment work, you know, helping people in accommodation to participate in community, to be connected, to maintain their tenancy and not go back onto the street. And the government strategy has got these three words, intervention, recovery and prevention. And I show you these things because I think a general shift that we're seeing, which is, you know, all of these provisions are needed to some degree. But often one of the reasons there's quite a lot of conflict with local authorities is because there's quite a lot of focus at this end of the street-based help. And certainly, you know, two years ago, you know, the levels of rough sleeping in Newham were really so significant, especially in the Stratford Centre. And a lot of the help going in there was causing a lot of conflict and a lot of difficulties. And it was a real challenge. And I think that, you know, I'm excited to see a shift in some of the focus especially from this left-hand side, more over towards this right-hand side, and seeing the growth of people being supported in accommodation. And I think those things are exciting because I think that there's often the most impact that can be had in terms of restoring relationships, in rebuilding people's identity. You know, once they're out of the real crisis and into a more settledness, and supporting them in that process of being settled and supported, I think is such a critical role. And a few things, you know, I mean, often social media is a real issue in this world, that it's often at this end, which is the most obvious way of like social media being relevant, and you know, getting a lot of likes and support online. But I think this side of things is so critical and so important, and it's often more hidden and less obvious, but it's so valuable. So that's a bit of a future, and I think that's a real shift that I certainly want to encourage, and I see happening. And I think it's this side that the church can do so well, of the befriending and coming alongside people. You know,
Oh,
just to go.
John, sorry, it's Angie. Can I jump back in on that previous slide, if that's
sure.
okay?
No, do.
I think most people know that I head up New Way, which is the church's night shelter. So we're sitting just in the centre on the left there. And hopefully people also know that we're sort of shifting more towards the right with New Day, which you mentioned, John, which is our sort of day centre offer. We've now recruited Amy Morton. I don't know if she's on this Zoom. I think she was hoping to be, but she's not. But Amy's heading up a part of New Way, which we're calling New Dawn, which is really starting to look at the supported housing and the befriending and tenancy sustainment. So New Way are kind of going round the fan in Newham. And so Amy's going to be contacting churches and church leaders within the next few weeks, starting to talk about church engagement with this sort of right-hand side of the fan in Newham. So I love your diagram so much, John. If you can send me this one, it explains New Way's journey, and I can give it to Amy and she can take all the credit. And as she goes around to churches with her presentation, but this is exactly what's been on our heart in Newham, that we move round to the right-hand side. You mentioned Green Pastures. We're in consultation with them. There's a fantastic book that Hope into Action have written, A House Built on Love, which, there we go. And it's something that's really, I think God is really stirring us in Newham, moving towards this side of the fan. So I just wanted the opportunity to kind of jump in and say, this is actively happening. We're being stirred in this borough, and this is the direction of travel, really, for us. We also don't want to let go of the night shelter. There's a good place for that. It's a fantastic way of churches coming together and supporting people. So I just wanted to jump in. Matthew's got his hand up now. So
yes, I want to build on what Angie said. I too want you to go back to your fan, please, John.
Okay, I'll bring the fan back on.
Because
I'm glad you're...
I'm a fan, yes. Two key things to say about this. Although you've made this specifically about homelessness, that intervention, recovery, prevention is a progression around all sorts of engagement. You could talk about that with food or with other engagement. Annie on the call from London City Mission with us. You could talk about that progression with women at the margins, women caught in domestic sexual violence, women caught in prostitution, a whole range of that movement. I want to say that very interestingly, I think this model needs developing now, John. It needs a 3-dimension, or it needs an overlay or something, because the churches have traditionally started at the left-hand side, and the mercy ministry is very welcome. You said earlier that local authorities want things done, so they're very happy to have some of that activity, as long as it doesn't trip into conflict. And yet, as you move round, it can be harder to get planning permission for supported housing or whatever, for example. But also, I want to flag, and I think it needs a graph really of mapping effort and time and money. The further you go round the fan, the more time, money, skill, expertise that's required. So there's an entry, and there's a sort of democratic. We can do this quickly. We can pull things together. Sure. We can apply our volunteers, and the skill level is not high. But once you get into delivering a drop-in centre with debt advice,
Yeah.
Talking about insurances. And once you're talking about building and supporting housing, you're into the whole planning regulation. So yeah. I think you really need to
I would say just to I would say that's absolutely, I'd say that's true definitely in providing supported housing and you know, complicated advice services. The only difference to what you're saying, I think, is at the other end, the befriending schemes can often be very, very simple, and can really build on the core strengths of churches. And I'm really excited to see a growth in these kind of schemes, you know, where, because often, you know, it's not expertise that people need. They do need expertise, but they also need a whole load of community and people around them and positive relationships and stuff like that. But I'm very happy to work on my fan, Matthew.
And so actually what between the two of us, what we've highlighted actually is the importance of partnership. So you've got specialist provision, and that's where the generalist local church comes around and adds the relationship, adds the friendship. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think the further you move to the right on this, the more partnerships happen. The one over on the left, it's often the more lone working and the more conflict and the more kind of, as I say, social media presence. Whereas on the right, there's a lot of the working together. Yeah. Shall I just I mean, just to go back to this diagram, I was thinking of the ways that these poverties are addressed, you know, in that, you know, with resources, there's the justice and the advocacy for people to get their rights and what they deserve, you know, with, say, benefits, but also the generosity, the practical support and provision, you know, with the different things that are provided to give people resources. But with relationships, you know, there's that sort of restored, healthy, reciprocal relationships, you know, people's connectivity with family and friends and involvement in community. These things are really, I think, you know, where churches can be really at home, because they're all about these things. You know, we've got a faith that is a relational faith. Churches are relational places. That we've got a ministry of reconciliation, you know, both with God, but with each other. And I think that, you know, helping people do relationships well is such a great thing that churches can help do. And lastly, you know, just most deeply, really, you know, this restored sense of self. And I think this is where the gospel is so relevant. People, the sense of being born again, of having a restored sense of self, the affirmation of God's love, forgiveness, hope, purpose, fulfillment, love. And it's really interesting, in a lot of homelessness conferences over the last few years, there's been a lot more talk about those words at the bottom, about the importance of forgiveness, hope, purpose, love. Because people are finding, over the last year, we've had a situation where a lot of rough sleepers in the country were offered hotels to move into because of the COVID situation. And it's been wonderful that so many have taken up that. And you know, I think about 38,000 people have gone into hotels. But in some places, there's still, even at the height of that everyone in process, there was still around 2,000 people on the streets. And it wasn't, in the vast majority of cases, it wasn't because offers weren't there. It was because of the depths of their challenges, and not able to take up an offer. And actually, you know, so it's not just a resources issue. You know, resources are vital, and don't hear me wrong, they're absolutely critical. But actually, a lot of people, to get out of the hole they're in, you know, need restored relationships. They need a restored sense of self in order to take the steps. And that's where I think that what the churches can do is just so critical. And coming back to, say, Jonathan's point about, you know, where's the hope? I think the hope comes in showing the gospel's relevance to all three of these circles, essentially. That actually we've got resources that can address the real needs of our nation. And you know, I'm convinced we have. I mean, just to say, going back to Chris, it was a church in the town where he was in Kent who came and visited him. It led to a long journey of renewal. But Chris has been my friend for the last 10 years, because basically a church has really helped him, you know, on that journey. having to go through a very long journey of lots of therapy and a lot of support. But you know, me and him have done a lot of talks together. We've written a little booklet together, and for me, he embodies that the fact that, you know, a church knocked on his door when he was resettled coming out of that mental institution has led to a whole journey, which has been, you know, incredible, and so positive. And now he's working in a homeless centre himself, and you know, doing great.
John, I'm very conscious that our time is moving on, and that,
absolutely,
that picture looks like Lee Abbey to me.
It is. It's me and Chris actually spoke at a weekend at Lee Abbey, so that was there.
Yeah, nice.
There's lots to say about him, but I mean, yeah, of course. I mean, that might be a good place to end, Matthew.
Lovely. Okay, well, we've been able to have a much more sort of informal flow as there's fewer of us together. Simon and I will be around till 11 for more sort of informal chat, but I do want to ask Pastor Jonathan to tell us about what he's working on towards Pentecost, because Pentecost in this lockdown and still can't meet. So Jonathan, how are you getting around this inability to have lots of people together, please?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I asked that question intentionally. It's not that I'm cynical as a person, but it's good to have questions answered from an authentic point of view, because then prophetically we know what to do. And I always like the picture in answer to, and I'm answering your question, Matthew, of the Moses and Joshua scenario, in that that narrative in the Bible where Moses, Aaron, and Hur were praying, worshiping on the mountain, and Joshua was engaging in the valley. And if we're just going to use that narrative, as the prayers were going up on the mountain, those in the valley were succeeding. And I see engaging with homelessness, engaging with our communities as the church, coming from the place of worship, coming from the place of prayer, coming from the place of the prophetic, getting engaged in the issues in our communities. That's the valley for me. So I'm about to present a mountaintop scenario here, where the church comes together in unity. We come together in worship, comes together in prayer on Pentecost Sunday. And it's something that the Lord has asked, we feel the Lord ask End Up to do. And so if I can share my screen, if that's allowed, this is just going to take a minute. And basically what we are hoping to do is to, we're hoping to do on the 23rd of May, get the whole church across the United Kingdom to come together in worship, in unity and prayer across Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. And if you can see my screen, and this is a minute long, so it's 60 seconds.
And God said, "Let there be light," and then there was light. On Sunday, 23rd of May 2021, nations, cultures, peoples, and colors shall collide in a beautiful fusion of worship and prayer as the global church unites across Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, and the Isles. Thousands shall come together at 2 p.m. on Pentecost Sunday in one accord. Register for virtual Pentecost today. It promises to be a historic gathering as thousands meet to pray healing, repentance, unity, renewal, and restoration for our land. Join in today by visiting www.virtualpentecost.com.
That's the advert that's been going out, and we've been speaking to Christians and the church in Ireland, and they want to come together North and South as one unit, and they want to pray into the whole issue around stepping into Europe and the borders and some of the stuff that's happening there. The Christians in Scotland are coming on board, the Christians in Wales and the Christians across England. We've got about 15,000 registrations according to the admin team, and we're encouraging the churches, everyone everywhere, to just go to virtualpentecost.com. I can make this video available. I can send it to through Matthew, and that can go out to the churches. And it's basically, we feel it's time for the church to unite, to pray into COVID, to pray into issues around unity, restoration, healing, repentance, our communities, many of the things that we're talking about now, praying into, and Holy Spirit revival. And it's the duality of the church, where we engage with the issues spiritually, but we also engage practically and physically, relationally and socially. And it's those two, or the elements of all of these narratives, that makes the church what it is. So 2 p.m. on Sunday is what we're going to be doing, and we're asking for Christians to register at virtualpentecost.com. Some want to do this at 11 o'clock, so we're going to make a service available for 1 o'clock, for 1 hour at 11, and then we're also going to do the main thing at 2 p.m. And we feel that this is just using the technology that we have in this situation we are in, but still uniting in spirit, so we can still come together even though we are physically apart. And the beauty of this is that people can log on anywhere. It's going to be on Zoom, it's going to be on Facebook, it's also going to be on TV, and it's going to be on social media like YouTube and all of those areas. So thank you for giving me the space to do this, Matthew.
Good day. Good day. We're bang on. Jonathan's done an exceptional job in condensing. There's such skill in being able to do that. Simon, a reflection, a sentence sort of roundup.
Thanks, John Kuhrt. That was just fantastic. Thank you so much. So stimulating and helpful. Really good. I love so many of your sentences that I'm going to steal without, if that's okay. But thank you.